The Invisible Rise, a tale of betrayal, patience, and unseen power, where a man, thought destroyed, learned strategy, silence, and precision to become the architect of inevitable reckoning. They said he was ordinary, a quiet worker with heavy eyes and steady hands, the kind of man people forget until they need someone to blame. But on the night everything shifted, the air itself leaned toward him as if fate had chosen a single target. Whispers crawled faster than facts. Suspicion spread like a sickness, and trust cracked under the slow pressure of envy. The system that promised safety smiled while sharpening its knives. He tried to stand tall, shoulders straight, voice calm. Yet, every step felt watched, every breath measured, every memory rewritten by others. When the accusation finally landed, it came without proof and without mercy. Friends became silhouettes. Loyalty evaporated. Doors closed without sound. And the crowd discovered how easy it is to destroy a man simply by agreeing to doubt him. Fear dressed itself as justice. Lies wore the uniform of concern. And silence became the loudest verdict of all. He searched faces for warmth and found only relief that it was not them standing there. The moment stretched, tightened, and broke something deep inside him. Dignity fell first, then hope followed. As Nelson Mandela once said, "The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall." And that night he fell harder than he ever had before, stripped of his name, his future, and his voice in a single breath, unaware that this collapse was only the opening move, that every eye watching would one day pretend they never saw him fall, and that the ending of this story would shock everyone who helped destroy him. Morning arrived without comfort. Light spilled through the cracks like an unwanted witness, and he woke to a world that had already decided who he was. Messages went unanswered. Familiar streets felt hostile, and every reflection asked a question he could not escape. Silence wrapped around him heavier than chains, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses on the chest and steals breath. He replayed every moment, searching for the exact second everything went wrong. But guilt had been planted where truth once lived. The noise outside continued as if nothing had happened. Laughter passed him by. Routine stayed intact, proving how small a life can feel once it is removed from the center. Hunger came and went unnoticed. Sleep fractured into sharp memories, and time slowed just to watch him suffer. He learned that abandonment rarely announces itself. It simply stops showing up. Even those who believed him chose comfort over courage, and he began to understand that injustice survives best in quiet rooms. Neighbors smiled politely while whispering behind curtains. Colleagues nodded while plotting their distance, and friends offered sympathy that tasted like ash. He counted the hours as if they were threats, each tick of the clock reminding him of a world moving on without care. The mirror reflected not a man but a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when a life is surrendered to rumor. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "In the end we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And that silence, that crushing, hollow absence of support, taught him the most bitter lesson, that isolation can be louder than any accusation. Yet somewhere beneath the weight of it a thin, stubborn pulse remained, barely alive, but refusing to disappear, waiting for a moment it could finally be heard, a moment that could turn despair into fire, pain into purpose, and the watching world into witnesses of something they never expected. The days blurred into nights, each one heavier than the last, and he felt the walls of the world pressing closer. Whispers followed him like shadows. Familiar streets seemed to twist in unfamiliar ways, and even the wind carried the scent of suspicion. He walked with measured steps, hoping to escape attention, but every eye turned without acknowledgement. Every smile hid a knife. The people he once trusted wore masks that revealed nothing, and the weight of betrayal became a second skin. He questioned every choice he had ever made, wondering which decision had set the machinery of destruction in motion. Yet the truth was slippery, almost impossible to grasp, like trying to hold water in trembling hands. Rumors multiplied, spreading faster than facts, and the world learned to condemn without proof, to judge without mercy, and to destroy without conscience. He tried to speak, but words failed him. They fell flat, bouncing back like stones thrown at an invisible wall. His voice became a ghost, unheard and ignored. Fear wrapped itself around him like a vine, climbing, tightening, choking, yet he moved forward, step by step, refusing to surrender completely. His mind became a battlefield, memories of betrayal colliding with instinctive survival. He watched as friends became strangers, as strangers became enemies, and as enemies became the judges of his every breath. Doors closed before he could reach them, voices hushed when he entered the room, and every gesture was read as a threat. Paranoia settled in. But so did determination, a quiet, almost invisible flame that whispered he would endure. He began to learn the patterns of cruelty, the rhythm of lies, and the silent architecture of betrayal. He counted each moment, each glance, each whisper, and stored them like ammunition, preparing for a reckoning that no one suspected. As Winston Churchill once said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts," and that courage, fragile yet persistent, became his shield and sword, a force growing in silence, ready to turn every shadow that hunted him into a witness of what he could survive, what he could overcome, and what he would make them all regret. Days turned into weeks, yet the world moved as if nothing had changed. People continued their routines, blind to the storm that had consumed him, and he learned to move like a shadow, unseen but observing, absorbing every detail, every whisper, every glance, every lie. He realized that survival depended not on strength but on patience, not on anger but on strategy, and not on trust but on careful calculation. The betrayal that had once shattered him became a lens, sharpening his awareness, revealing weaknesses in those who had sought to destroy him. He practiced silence like a skill, letting the world speak while he listened, letting actions reveal character, letting mistakes accumulate unnoticed until the moment they could be used. Yet even as he built this quiet resolve, loneliness gnawed at him, a constant companion reminding him of what had been lost. Love, friendship, innocence, all evaporated into the smoke of suspicion, and still he walked forward, head down, eyes open, heart guarded, learning that patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. As Lao Tzu once said, "He who conquers others is strong. He who conquers himself is mighty." And in conquering himself, he began to find a power no one could take, a strength born not from fighting others, but from mastering his own fear, his own doubt, and his own despair, preparing silently for the moment when the world would finally notice that he had not fallen at all, that the destruction meant to break him had only built him into something unstoppable, something terrifying in its inevitability, something that would leave everyone who doubted him shocked beyond measure. Months had passed since the night everything collapsed, yet not a single soul who had watched him fall suspected that the man they had destroyed was quietly rising. He had learned the rhythm of betrayal, memorized the whispers that had turned friends into shadows, and cataloged every slight, every word, every glance, storing them like ammunition for the moment he would act. The world moved around him with careless arrogance, confident in the finality of his ruin, unaware that patience was being forged in the quiet corners of his days. He tested the edges of his strength in silence. Small victories no one noticed. A door held open just a second longer. A fact revealed just quietly enough to unsettle the right person. A challenge delivered through subtlety rather than confrontation. And each tiny success sharpened his focus, like a blade whetted against stone. Yet even in this calculated return, he never lost sight of the cost, the loneliness that pressed on his chest, the faces of those who had turned away, the nights spent counting shadows instead of stars. And he allowed that memory to fuel him, turning pain into precision, doubt into strategy, and fear into anticipation. For he understood that the first strike is never the most powerful. It is the one that opens the path, the one that reminds the world that destruction is not permanent when the destroyed has learned to move unseen. Whispers of his return began to ripple through the corners of the city, subtle and almost imperceptible, but those who had underestimated him felt it as unease, a creeping tension in the air, a momentary pause in their certainty. And he smiled quietly at their discomfort, knowing it was only the beginning. As Sun Tzu once said, "Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak." And he had mastered the art of appearing broken while quietly building an unstoppable force, preparing for the moment when the world would finally realize that the man they thought they destroyed had never truly fallen, only disappeared into the shadows to gather power, patience, and strategy, waiting for the precise instant when every betrayal, every whisper, every glance turned against him would pay dividends beyond imagination, and that instant, when it came, would shock them all. Every day became a calculation, every gesture a potential signal, every conversation a battlefield, and he moved like a ghost through the world that had once suffocated him, invisible yet present, learning the patterns of power, the weaknesses of those who had celebrated his fall, and the subtle ways fear could be planted without a word. He watched how people stumbled over their own arrogance, how pride made them predictable, how alliances formed and crumbled like sandcastles at high tide, and he stored each observation carefully, letting it accumulate until the moment it could be turned into influence, a weapon far sharper than anger, far more precise than revenge. Yet he never lost sight of the cost, the nights alone, the quiet ache in his chest, the memory of laughter that had turned to whispers, all reminders that what he was building required patience and discipline beyond ordinary endurance. He tested his plans in silence, adjusting, refining, letting events unfold without interference, letting others believe they controlled the story while he quietly rewrote the rules. He learned that control was not about showing strength. It was about shaping perception, bending circumstances until inevitability aligned with his vision. And as he moved through the city, unseen and underestimated, a quiet smile touched his lips, for he understood the power of the unseen hand, the calculated strike, the timing of revelation. As Bruce Lee once said, knowing is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do. And he had become both willing and precise, applying everything he had learned in quiet mastery, ready for the moment when the world that had destroyed him would realize too late that he had been moving while they slept, preparing for a reckoning that would leave no one untouched, no one unquestioning, and no one capable of saying they saw it coming. The world continued to move around him as if he had vanished, as if the man they had destroyed belonged only to the memory of their gossip and fear. Yet he was far from gone, each day weaving invisible threads through the lives of those who had celebrated his fall, each quiet observation a stitch in the fabric of his return. He learned who lied without hesitation, who betrayed without remorse, who feared without reason, and who believed themselves untouchable, and he marked them all, storing knowledge as a general stores maps before battle. He began to test the limits of their confidence, small, almost imperceptible shifts in circumstance, a missing document here, a misleading suggestion there, a rumor whispered into the right ear, all subtle, all precise, all unnoticed by anyone but him. The city moved in blind certainty, pride swelling in those who had looked down on him, while he moved through the shadows, gathering strength from the mistakes of others. Patience had become his armor, invisibility his shield, and calculation his sword. He let no emotion dictate his moves, only reason, only timing, only the invisible architecture of inevitability. And he felt a thrill not from revenge, but from the perfection of the process. For every small disruption, every falter, every crack in their certainty proved that he was no longer the man they had destroyed. He had become something sharper, colder, smarter, almost untouchable, yet always watching, always waiting, always aware. As Friedrich Nietzsche once said, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. And in every trial, every betrayal, every day of isolation he had grown stronger, transforming pain into strategy, silence into influence, fear into understanding, preparing for the moment when the world would see that the fall they had celebrated had only been the first act in a story they could not possibly have imagined, a story that would end with shock, awe, and the realization that destroying him had only given him the power to remake the world around them, in ways they could never predict. And in that quiet, unseen preparation, he smiled, knowing the tide was turning, slowly, inexorably, toward him. The first signs of change arrived like whispers carried on a wind no one noticed, small tremors in the lives of those who had destroyed him, unnoticed mistakes, subtle hesitations, the faintest cracks in their confidence. And yet to him, they shouted like thunder, each one proof that the careful patience of months had begun to bear fruit. He had learned to manipulate without touching, to influence without speaking, to bend events without revealing his hand. Every action, every observation, every quiet step had been a preparation for this moment, and now the echoes of his presence began to ripple outward, invisible but unstoppable. People felt unease without knowing why. They blamed coincidence, bad luck, or fleeting doubt, never realizing that the architect of their discomfort was walking quietly among them. Yet even as he moved, he reminded himself that subtlety was more powerful than spectacle, patience more dangerous than brute force, and timing more lethal than anger. Each whisper of disruption planted with meticulous care, each falter of his enemies noted and stored for later. He understood the beauty of invisibility, the poetry of influence, and the terrifying power of a mind that refused to be broken. And in the quiet, he let himself feel a tiny spark of satisfaction, not for revenge, but for control, for proof that the world could not destroy what refused to die. As Sun Tzu once said, opportunities multiply as they are seized, and he had been seizing every opportunity silently, invisibly, for months, until the moment would come when the world could no longer ignore him. When the man they had thought destroyed would suddenly reappear not as a victim, but as a force that no one could contain, a force that would make every whisper of doubt, every glance of betrayal, every moment of cruelty turn back upon its author. And the first echoes of that reckoning were already beginning to disturb the air, subtle but undeniable, a prelude to the storm that was coming. Every move he made now carried weight, invisible threads linking moments, people, and events into a web only he could see. He had become a silent architect, designing consequences with the precision of a master, each action perfectly timed, each silence perfectly placed, and those who had destroyed him began to falter. Though they remained blind to the reason, mistakes multiplied, alliances cracked, and confidence wavered, while he observed quietly, calculating, storing each misstep like ammunition for the decisive moment. He had learned the art of patience, the power of watching, the subtle control of events without ever revealing himself. The city became his chessboard, and people moved as predictable pieces, each step revealing more than they ever intended. The whispers that had once destroyed him now returned, but redirected, bending toward him like wind pushing a sail, yet he did not rush. He allowed the web to grow, to stretch, to capture, knowing that the strength of a trap lies in its invisibility until the moment it closes. Even those who prided themselves on foresight stumbled in ways he had foreseen, and he smiled quietly at the perfection of the design. Knowing that destruction without precision is wasted energy, that revenge without strategy is hollow, that power without patience is fleeting, he had mastered the art of waiting, of preparing, of letting the world destroy itself in small, unnoticed increments. And he became not only survivor, but conductor of inevitability. As Miyamoto Musashi once said, perceive that which cannot be seen with the eye. And he perceived everything, the hidden fears, the unspoken alliances, the cracks in their armor, the hesitation in their steps. And he knew that the moment of revelation was coming, a moment when the man they thought destroyed would appear not as broken, but as something far beyond their comprehension, a force reshaping the very world that had tried to crush him. And every piece of his web was in place, silent, patient, unstoppable, waiting for the precise instant when it would close and shock everyone who had ever doubted him. The first cracks in their confidence became visible not as grand gestures, but as tiny, almost imperceptible shifts, missed deadlines, faltering words, subtle mistakes. And yet they could not explain why. He moved among them like a ghost, unseen but unstoppable, every action measured, every silence deliberate. And the city that had once written him off now felt tremors without knowing their source. Whispers grew louder, doubts spread like wildfire, and alliances began to crumble as confidence fractured. He did not act with fury, he acted with inevitability, letting the world collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Every face that had once smiled at his destruction now registered confusion, unease, fear, a sense that the rules they had assumed were permanent were shifting beneath them. He had become more than a man, more than a survivor. He was now the force that made them confront the consequences of their actions. And he relished the perfection of timing, the beauty of patience, the poetry of silent vengeance. As Marcus Aurelius once said, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way, and every obstacle they had placed before him had only guided him to this moment, this orchestrated revelation, this reckoning. And when the first voices of doubt and panic rose, he knew that the tide had turned, that the man they had thought broken was now the one shaping the outcome. Every shadow of betrayal they had cast returned to them sharpened. Every lie they had whispered became a mirror reflecting their own failures, and the city held its breath, unaware that the storm had arrived, silent, precise, and inevitable, ready to shock everyone who had ever doubted him. The city teetered on the edge of realization, small tremors of doubt exploding into chaos as one mistake led to another, each carefully orchestrated by him. Every move of his enemies now predictable, every whispered lie returning like a boomerang. They stumbled blindly through the consequences of their own arrogance, and he moved unseen, watching as the structures they had built on certainty began to collapse. Patience had become power, invisibility had become control, and strategy had become inevitability. He did not need to shout, did not need to confront, for the unraveling happened on its own, each domino falling perfectly, each crack widening into a chasm, and the people who had celebrated his fall could only grasp at fragments. Desperate to understand how the world had shifted beneath them, he smiled quietly, not for revenge, but for proof that preparation and patience are deadlier than fury. The man they had tried to destroy was no longer a victim. He was the force behind every misstep, every falter, every breakdown. And even as panic spread, he remained composed, calculating, precise, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of inevitable ruin. As Sun Tzu once said, in the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity, and he had created chaos so perfectly that every opportunity belonged to him. Every trembling hand, every faltering voice, every crumbling alliance guided by his unseen hand. The city felt unsteady, the foundations of arrogance shaken, the pride of the ruthless humbled, and in every glance, every whispered conversation, he could see the shock building, the realization dawning slowly yet unstoppable, that the man they had destroyed was not only alive, but had become the architect of their undoing, the invisible storm no one could control, the reckoning they could not escape.